Laavanya was scheduled to go first, so let's follow with the schedule.
That's right. Okay, so
yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, okay, good. Hi, good morning, everybody. This is our session on essentially on racism in Singapore, organized by the Malaysia and Singapore Society of Australia and co-sponsored by AcademiaSG. I'm sorry that we're a little bit late. We had some technical issues to sort out, but without much further ado, let me quickly introduce our speakers. I will do so in the order in which they will excuse me, in which they will be speaking. And essentially, we are going to run with people with presentations in alphabetical order, and then folks that are not using presentations. So we will begin with Laavanya Kathiravelu, who is a assistant professor at the Nanyang Technological University. She works significantly on issues of race and migration in Singapore. So, and hold on a second, I'm having, okay, so she's with the Division of Sociology, and her research interests lie in the intersection between migration and citizenship, urban studies, race and ethnicity. We'll next, after that, have Lily Rahim, who for many years has been president of MASSA and until recently professor of global studies at Monash University, Malaysia. She's currently honorary fellow at Georgetown University in Washington, DC. She's author of numerous books and journal articles on authoritarian governance in Singapore and Malaysia, democratization in Southeast Asia, ethnic and majoritarian politics, political Islam. She's currently engaged in a global study on majoritarian racial privilege and resistance to substantive multiracial nation building. Following Lily, we'll have Alfian. Alfian Saad is a multi-talented artist and a keen observer of Singapore, whose work often bridges different perspectives and cultures and also genres. So apart from being an accomplished poet, he is one of the country's top playwrights and dramaturgs. And to close off everything, we have Kwee Kian, who's Associate Professor of Chinese Studies at the National University of Singapore. She's a historian and real expert on colonialism, commerce, and ethnic Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. Everyone will have about 15 minutes. I understand we'll be kicked out once we're out of time, so I'm going to be quite brutal with the 15 minutes so we are able to have Q&A at the end. For people who have questions, please either use the raise hand function or use the chat function to send it to me. What I'll do is I'll either recognize you and get you to speak, or if you send the chat to me, I can also read out your questions. Okay, since we're a bit behind time, without much further ado, Lavi, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so first of all, thank you everyone for inviting me today, to the organizers of the symposium, to academia.edu, and to my fellow panelists. So this morning, I'm going to be talking about Indian immigrants and using the theme of COVID, that is the theme of MASSA this year, to think about issues of xenophobia and racism that have risen during this COVID-19 pandemic in Singapore. And I'm going to talk about a double minority. So Indian immigrants who are minoritized, not just racially, but also because of their immigration status. And this is the outline of my talk for today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the racialized immigration regime in Singapore and intra-ethnic conflict, so conflict within the larger Indian community of Singapore, and how we can see this as xenophobic, but really also as a form of racism, how we can think of xenophobia as a form of racism and problematizing this, this notion of race, right? That's used not just by the state, but also in terms of everyday usage in Singapore. Then I'll talk a little bit about the nation, notions of belonging and who belongs within the nation and how this is raised in particular ways as well. And finally, a little kind of theoretical note. So this is a work in progress. Appreciate your feedback about this, but I'm kind of playing with this notion of racial assemblages. And I think this example allows me to think through race as an assemblage. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. So firstly, a little, big picture scene setting about Singapore and its immigration regime, right? So we can see on the right-hand side, my slide shows...
sorry, Lavi, we're not seeing your slide. We're seeing your home screen, your desktop, but not your slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. Have you been not seeing my slide the whole time? Or...
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, no. Okay. Let's see. Let's try this. Is this better? Can you see the slide? Okay. Yes. So anyway, I'll just go back and show you my outline. And then, okay, so on the right-hand side, you see the graph shows the total fertility rate in Singapore. So you can see that it's declining overall, as our government keeps telling us. And if you look at the Indian line, it is, it's a red line and it's declining. It's slightly higher than the Chinese 0.96, but, one of the lowest as well. So we know that Indians are not, reproducing at the right rate, right, to replace themselves. And then on the left-hand side, we see here the total number of citizenships and permanent residencies granted, and it's quite stable around the 25,000 mark. For citizenships, and for PRs around the 30,000 mark, right? So I show you this to make the case that, of course, we know all this, that Singapore has very high immigration rates, and now about 40% of our population is foreign born, right? But what is interesting about Singapore's immigration regime is that even though we've had a lot of migration, almost 1 million people who have migrated in the last 15 to 20 years, the racial proportions of the nation state haven't changed. And this, of course, refers only to Singaporeans and permanent residents, so not temporary migrant workers like low-wage Bangladeshi and Indian migrants, but this is, what's seen as kind of the core of the nation, right? Permanent residents and citizens. And the proportions of those have hardly changed. As you can see, this is from 2011 and this is 2021, so over 10 years. And with this actually back even to 2010, and the rates haven't changed. And this is a very strategic policy, right, that the Singapore state adopts. And Mark Frost writes about this and talks about this kind of racist immigration regime that is conceived to maintain a kind of racial balance. And the reason for this, of course, has been stated as because, this is what encourages social stability, right? Maintaining this racial balance encourages stability and won't kind of rock the social foundations of the nation. So therefore, we've had a very strategic immigration regime. And we can see, looking at, sorry about the slide, it's a bit blur. I kind of took a picture of something. The biggest proportion of immigrants are really in the Indian category and in the other category. Right, so we can see the people who have been overwhelmingly granted permanent residency and citizenship are in the other category. So anyone who doesn't belong to Chinese, Malay, or Indian, and in the Indian category. And we can see this because, so you see the people who are born outside Singapore are the lighter color, and the Indians have the biggest proportion of people born outside Singapore. Of course, if we don't pay attention to the others, right? And they've always had the biggest proportions, but those proportions have been growing. Right. So all this I show you as a way to make the case for looking at Indian immigration as a significant empirical and social phenomena. Right. This is a large group of people who are migrating to Singapore, taking up citizenship and permanent residency, and fundamentally changing the demographics of the Indian group in Singapore. And I've written about the kind of changing demographics of this group in a book chapter in a volume called Integration in Singapore that came out, I think, last year or the year before. So, and in there I talk about mostly the class dynamics, but so the new immigrants are hyper-selected. They are highly educated, they have very well-paying jobs, and this has raised the kind of median incomes as well as education levels of the Indian community in general. So we know that is happening, and we know there are other changes in terms of linguistic changes. So a lot of the new Indian immigrants are not Tamil speaking. So the kind of nature of what Indian means to be in Singapore is changing, right? So along with that, so today I don't really want to concentrate so much on those differences because I've talked about that elsewhere, right? But what I want to talk about a little bit is the intra-Indian tension and racism, in fact, within this community. Right. So the assumption of the state has been, okay, if we maintain racial proportions, if we bring in people with similar cultural ancestral backgrounds, there will be less tensions in terms of our multiracialism. But this hasn't been the case, right? And here I provide a quote from interviews I've been doing with middle class or elite Indian migrants in Singapore. And I'll just give you a second to read it. It's a quote by Vishal, who's 29 years old. So he expresses a sentiment that a lot of my Indian immigrant interviewees express, and they don't often tell me this because I'm read as Singaporean Indian, but I usually have research assistants who are Indian immigrants themselves to do these interviews, and interestingly, they get more of this type of data than I do, right? Because maybe there's some reluctance to tell me about the racism they face from other or discrimination they face from other Singaporean Indians. But this is a sentiment that keeps coming up that, Singaporean Indians or Singaporeans of Indian origin distance themselves from new Indian immigrants, and actually other Singaporeans of other racial origins, Chinese Singaporeans or Malay Singaporeans, are more likely to form friendships with Indian immigrants, right? So we see these kind of tensions, and this is a very kind of low level distancing, I guess, or differentiation going on. But this during the COVID-19 pandemic has translated into more aggressive and more violent tendencies. So on the left here, I have a picture that's a screenshot of a video where this Indian Singaporean man, and he identifies himself as Singaporean by forefronting his national service record. And it's about, the video shows a confrontation between him and an Indian migrant family, right? And he's kind of saying, you're not wearing your mask, you're not social distancing, very aggressively, moving his arms about, getting very worked up about this. And why I highlight this incident amongst the various incidents that have been directed against Indian immigrants during COVID is because of the kind of shared race or assumed shared race of these two individuals, right? So in one of the comments on YouTube, when I was watching this video on YouTube recently, one of the comments that I picked up in the bottom was, how can it be racist if they're both from the same race, right? So this is a kind of interesting, I guess, way in which we can think about intra-ethnic tensions. Can we really think of it as racism when two people are from ostensibly the same race, right? And what I want to suggest here is that racism is not really about race, right? Racism is really a way of indicating your place within a hierarchy, as the writer Derek Bell talks about race, right? This is not about skin color, it's not about ancestry, but it's about putting you within a certain space within a hierarchy of who belongs and who doesn't belong, or who is seen as authentic or fully human and who is not. Right. So similarly, I want us to start thinking here then about Indian immigrants as racialized in specific ways in Singapore, right? And racialized to not belong to the nation. And conversely then, for the Singaporean Indian who wants to disassociate from this Indian immigrant, they have to disavow in many ways their racial affinity. Like in this video, the man talks about his national service record and the fact that he's Singaporean, and this keeps being repeated, right? And you are bloody Indians is what he calls this family, right? So there's this kind of, there starts to emerge a disjuncture between, being Indian and being Singaporean, right? So that's the kind of what I want to suggest is happening here, especially with COVID. We can see this much more clearly, right? So we know there's been a kind of rise of national identity in Singapore, and nationalism in Singapore that's pitched against the migrant other, right? And recently, Indian migrants have been the kind of migrant other against which a lot of this nationalist sentiment has been expressed. But I want us to focus here on the position of Singaporean Indians to see what this means then for them as a racial minority within Singapore. Right, so on one hand, we see the kind of disavowal of racial affinity and the claim of national belonging as a way to claim a stake and authenticity and belonging in the nation. And conversely, on the other hand, Indian immigrants who have been naturalized, who've become Singaporean, this large proportion that I showed earlier statistically or demographically, must foreground their nationality in order for their claims to be taken seriously, right? So in this other incident where an Indian origin woman was attacked in Singapore, she was going for her morning walk or something, and she didn't have a mask on her face, and she was kicked or punched or something, right? I'm sure you all remember that incident. And what is interesting in the write-ups of that is that this woman claimed, I've been Singaporean for so long. Like, she was an Indian immigrant, but her Singaporeanness is something that she has to foreground. So it's not enough that she was attacked as a human being, as an individual, but her Singaporeanness makes it, it makes her a legitimate kind of victim, right, of attack. So we see these two different things going on. Right. And here I have a quote from another informant, Jay Shree, who is a permanent resident. And she talks about how a lot of these incidents are escalated when it happens to be a minority race. So I should have bolded this, but if you pay attention to the last line, it's very common in Singapore, the social policing, she says. And if it happens to be a minority race, I think it gets escalated very fast. Right. So the minoritization of identity and of race then brings these, makes these incidents more significant, right? And puts light on these issues of national belonging. And I think what she says here is really interesting because it's basically implying that when you're a minority, your belonging, your identity is questioned more within the multiracial nation. You're not automatically seen to belong to the nation or be part of it, but you have to justify how you belong. Are you a Singaporean? Are you naturalized? Were you born here, right? These questions often come up, and this relates to the kind of escalation of these incidents, right? And here I have another one where that happened recently over the National Day period, right? There was a poster in Tanjong Pagar, the Tanjong Pagar area, and that poster featured this Indian family, and a lot of people started posting quite xenophobic, racist remarks on social media in relation to this poster, right?
Sorry, 2 minutes.
Okay, I'm gonna hurry. Okay, so basically, questioning the kind of nationality of this family, and it turns out that this family is very Singaporean or local born, and the son is a national runner even. So again, this points to the fact that Indians have to prove their belonging to the nation, right? They're not ever assumed to just belong, but their identity, their belonging is questioned. And they have to distinguish themselves from the Indian immigrant. And, in my other work, co-written paper with Elaine Ho, we talk about issues of place of birth, length of stay, and contribution to the nation in terms of national service, for example, as emerging as important markers of differentiation, right? So where all this brings me to is my kind of larger theoretical point in making us think about, race in different ways, right? And this quote from Siddharth, one of my informants as well, really helps me make this point, right? And he talks about how I don't know how much Indian I am here, because being Indian in India and being Indian in Singapore is completely different, right? So we might, of course, we acknowledge that, Indian in Singapore and Indian in India is different, but what does this mean for our understandings of race, right? Especially when in the literature, race, Indianness is defined in very singular ways, and also within our immigration policy, right? So finally, just to conclude, these are some of my key kind of theoretical points that I want to make, right? And I want to say that we need to think about race beyond an intersectional lens, right? So if we think intersectionally, we might claim that people in the Indian immigrants and the Singaporean Indian share race or ethnicity, but differ according to class, nationality, or immigration status, right? But what exactly do these Singaporean Indians and Indian immigrants share? As my previous quote showed, it means very different things, right? So the meaning imputed to Indian in itself, this race or this racial category, is actually different, right? And in my paper with Elaine, we talk about how we should see then Indian Singaporean and in India-born Indian as two different ethnic groups, rather than as subcategories of Indianness or subcategories of a race or ethnicity, as equal levels of categorization of ethnicity, right? So here, class or nationality is not just added.
Maybe wrap it up.
Yeah, I'm wrapping up my to some notion of Indianness. But Indianness itself has these multiple meanings, right? And the notion of assemblage then gives us the language or the tools to think about how race is not a singular entity, but made up of these multiple logics, right? And complex and changing in different circumstances. Okay, I will end it there, but please let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lavi. And to not waste time, we'll move right on to Lily. Please go ahead. Lily, you're muted. You could unmute yourself.
Yep. Okay. Press share screen. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Before I do my presentation, I'd like to thank the Malaysia and Singapore Society of Australia, in particular Yao Tong, the president of MASSA, for organizing this event, in addition to James Chin from Hobart University. This paper that I'm presenting is essentially very much a work in progress paper, part of a larger book project, which I commenced about 1.5 years ago. Essentially, it's a comparative global study of race supremacy and the majoritarian mindsets underpinning that, and its impact on democratization and democratic processes. As I noted earlier, it's a comparative study, it's global, it looks at the United States of America, Australia, Malaysia, and Singapore. And this is the kind of the Singapore component of the project, which is still in its stage of crystallization. Okay. Now, race, the topic of race is, and religion is very much a sensitive issue, particularly in the public domain, when discussed in the public domain. Associated with that, the issue of multiracialism, meritocracy, and so on. These are the themes that the government takes pride in, that we're constantly being informed that Singapore is a successful multiracial and meritocratic society. But as I noted earlier, these discussions of race tend to be, public discussions in particular, tend to be truncated. Truncated because it appears as though the PAP government and the state media have strongly attempted to define the parameters of discussion, public discussion of these issues. So, in other words, the analysis tends to be quite shallow and staid, at least in the public domain. And if you rely on the Straits Times, for example, for information on this topic, it's pretty much one-dimensional. It's triumphalist, as I noted earlier. Racist incidents, when they occur, have been very much individualized. A few bad, rotten apples. Basically, this is not us. But importantly, institutional and systemic perspectives tend to be largely avoided and dismissed. And what's interesting is that critical race theory has been singled out and targeted, particularly by the mainstream media and also by the PAP leaders in government and the PAP establishment as being somehow irrelevant to study race relations in Singapore. But the paradox here, and this has been highlighted by quite a few people, the paradox here is that Singapore is a very deeply racialized polity. That race strongly shapes public policy governance. So we look at housing policies and the ethnic quotas right down to the very block. It's very race-based. Immigration and population policies, as pointed out by Laavanya earlier on, is very much race-based. That the Chinese proportion has remained and at the mid-70s, and this is because of deliberate immigration policies. Education policies are very much racialized, as exemplified by the existence of the SAP schools. Language policies, the systematic promotion of Mandarin in Singapore, one of the official languages. And if you didn't know, you think that Mandarin was the national language of Singapore, when in fact it is Malay. The electoral system is very much racialized with the existence of the GRC system and so on. So a very racialized polity. But as I noted earlier, discussions of race lack depth, particularly within the public domain. For various reasons, restrictions on independent media, and as some of us are aware, one online website has been essentially turned off. Compliance of the mainstream media, basically, following the government perspective on various issues, and hence this truncated public discussion. With regard to the mainstream media, we need to look at Singapore's World Press Freedom Index in 2021. It is hovering at 160. This is even worse than the media index in places like Myanmar. And it says something. Restrictive laws such as POFMA, FICA, and a whole slew of other laws, which tends to restrict the flow of public debate on issues such as race. And this is something I'll be talking about a bit more later, the majoritarian mindset or Chinese privilege mindset in Singapore, which I argue is quite deeply embedded. And as I noted earlier, the dominant triumphalist narrative of Singapore as a successful multiracial society. Now, what I found particularly useful in my research, some of these works, which I'll go through quickly, in particular, Ibram Kendi's work, How to Be an Anti-Racist, published in 2019, which fits in nicely with the critical race theory framework. But with Kendi, he puts forward the view, and this is the framework that I've used for years, that racial privilege is facilitated by a marriage of racist policies as well as racist ideas. And this then produces and normalizes racial inequities. So we need then to identify what these racist policies are, these structures, these racist institutions, and so on. And it is very important we do that, because as Ibram Kendi nicely puts it, I think, that racism is an existential threat, much like climate change. It corrodes the socio-economic and democratic fabric of many countries. And so if we look at many countries around the world, particularly authoritarian states, they tend to be less inclusive. And so on. So Isabel Wilkinson is another author who's written an excellent piece, publication entitled Scarce, The Origins of Our Discontent. And what I found particularly insightful about her book is the comparative global angle, comparative study of racism, institutional structural racism in Nazi Germany, the United States, and India. And she says racial hierarchy, privilege, or she prefers to use the term caste, is about power, as Laavanya nicely noted earlier on. It's about power, which groups have it, which groups do not. It is about resources, it is about respect, authority, it's about assumptions of competence, who is accorded this and who is not. And so we find that and this is found in much of the academic scholarship on racism. It thrives on inequality. It thrives on false rivalries. It thrives on fear. It thrives on economic, social insecurity. Robin DiAngelo, most of us would be aware of her book, White Fragility, and Layla Syed's Me and My White Supremacy, I find really insightful. Notions to do with racial centering, which groups are centered, which groups are overrepresented, which groups are perceived as the norm, and which groups suffer from this racial fragility symptoms. When their privilege is pointed out, they tend to be defensive, they tend to get angry, they deny the existence of privilege, or they don't even recognize the privilege that they have. They often suffer from a victimhood complex, and they often assert their majoritarian status when they feel defensive. And a very good example of that is found within the supporters of Donald Trump. Now, some of us are aware of this report by the UN Special Rapporteur, Gitu Mulgai. In 2010, he arrived in Singapore as part of his work as a UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Now, his policy recommendations for the Singapore government is really interesting, and it is relevant till this day. And this is, this report was written more than 20 years ago. He noted the ethnic integration policy for housing, the race quotas. He says it has created real problems for ethnic minorities, and he has suggested reforms, major reforms to these. He's pointed out the special assistant plan schools has marginalized non-Chinese students in particular. He talks about how under Article 152 of Singapore's Constitution, it recognizes the state's responsibility towards the Malay community as indigenous to the country. And this community has remained along the socio-economic fringes of society, and the government needs to step in and address historical inequalities via specific programs. Malay individuals continue to be underrepresented in senior positions of the armed forces, the police, intelligence services. He also notes the judiciary. He says government needs to review laws, regulations, guidelines, and so on. He talks about how the government has seemed to favor migrants from certain countries. And this was published, this report was released in 2010, and he's essentially referring to Chinese migrants in particular, and to a lesser extent, Indian migrants. Specific legislation prohibiting racial discrimination in all areas of life. Till this day, we don't have an anti-discrimination law, and the government is talking finally about introducing this law. So it's taken them a lot of time. The rapporteur, the special rapporteur, has pointed out to the efficacy or lack of the PCMR, the Presidential Council of Minority Rights. He's noted that it's never issued a statement or taken a position on any particular legislation or public policy, even those that have adversely affected ethnic minorities. And these are some of
2 minutes.
And these are some of the issues I noted in the Singapore Dilemma and my other book, Singapore in the Malay World. In particular, I talk about Malay privilege in Malaysia, Ketuanan Melayu, and I highlight this point that in Singapore, we actually have the same happening. It's Chinese privilege, Ketuanan Cina. That in Singapore, we have this syndrome of the Chinese, as a result of government policies, suffering from a majority-minority complex, being in a minority in the Malay world. And I'll go through this quickly because I'm running out of time. A young Singaporean, Sagita Tanapal, has done a fantastic job in enlightening the public on Chinese privilege. Unfortunately, we've lost her to Australia, but she continues to write extensively about this. There's Sudhir Badaketh, there's Walid Abdullah, there's of course Alfian Saad, who is with us in our panel today. But I'll just finish off with these points, that when we're talking about race privilege in Singapore, I think we really need to look closely at Lee Kuan Yew's ideas on eugenics and racial hierarchies to get a sense of where all of this is coming from. And the two biographies of Lee Kuan Yew by James Minchin and Michael Barr look in depth at these views on this, his views on hierarchies. In the Singapore context, he believes that Singapore is what it is today because of the racial eugenics traits of the Chinese. And this is why Singapore is successful. So, you know, when I read this year about the nasty hate crimes against ethnic minorities, I was not surprised. I believe this is the tip of the iceberg. And this was reinforced by the Prime Minister's speech in 2001, that Chinese privilege is baseless, typical denial logic. The PAP government has been impartial in its laws, a denial logic again. The Chinese speakers have already made concessions and been in a disadvantaged position. Pretty much victimhood logic. This fits in with the framework explanations of critical race theory. And these denials, these assertions, all reinforce basically the existence of Chinese privilege in Singapore. And I'll end off there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. So if you could stop the screen share, if we could ask Alfian to begin his presentation. Thanks. Alfian, you're
okay, thank you so much. I'm just going to jump in and start my presentation, actually. Okay. So my presentation is called Mature Content, Strong Racial References, the Management of Racial Discourse in Singapore Theatre. So I'll try to stick to the 15 minutes time limit, and so I'll just breeze through this, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to examine a few plays that were done in Singapore. I'll start with this play called Charge in 2010. The synopsis says, it's Chinese New Year and the only soldiers in camp on guard duty are Malay or Indian. That is until Corporal Russell Lim turns up. Things start turning ugly when the insults start flying and all that's taboo becomes fair game. By the end of the night, a Chinese and a Malay soldier are found dead. So as it transpires in this play, Russell Lim is an officer, and some of the men who are in camp discovered the fact that he had bullied a Malay subordinate when he was in officer cadet school. So he got a dog to lick that boy as part of his punishment. Okay, so I'm gonna just share with you some of the lines from the play. These are two bits of dialogue from the Malay characters in the play. So Imran says, now you talk big, you use your rank to put me down. But when Malaysia attack us, when Indonesia attack us, who do you think will run? Who will stay? You sergeant, so what? You will run back to India to be with your people. He will also run back to China. All the other races will go back to their father's country and leave us here to defend our home. Zubair says, I knocked on my employer's door only to have him tell me they don't hire Malays. Isn't it enough that I have to be included in that national statistic of drugs and crime? We have to keep reassuring the world that we are a gentle race. We are not terrorists. You can stamp my passport and let me through customs. Don't give me a second look. Okay, Hakim, another Malay character in the play, says to Russell, it's nothing personal, but you're nothing to me. We may go to school together, maybe watch and play soccer together. We may sit next to each other in the bus and train. You may come to our Malay weddings and eat our food. But Chinese like you don't see us. There's so many of you around. You run this country. You don't have to think or care about us. Our feelings are not important to you. And finally, we have Russell here, who makes an admission of why he did what he did in terms of that racist bullying. He says, I dragged that dog to lick my Malay trainee because I wasn't thinking. I wasn't thinking because I didn't think it would matter. I didn't think it would matter because I don't really think about the Malays or Indians in Singapore. It's not a concern or an issue to me. So this particular line is interesting to me because it reflects, right, the hazards, the moral hazards of adopting a certain kind of post-racial position. Okay, so I'm just also going to share with you what IMDA said about the play and how it's rated it. So IMDA says the play is rated R18 with a consumer advised mature content coarse language as it explores sensitive themes of racial prejudices and stereotypes of a particular race. Due to the realistic portrayal of racial tensions and use of strong language within the army camp, the issues discussed could be uncomfortable for some members of the audience and unsuitable for younger audiences. Okay, I'll go straight to another play here. This is called Poor Thing in the year 2014. Synopsis says, a unique production involving social media interaction, Poor Thing will invite audiences to watch a video clip of an accident before they enter the theater to catch the live action on stage. During the performance, more clips will be posted online, which audiences can view and comment on. Poor Thing challenges you to explore what drives road rage in Singapore. Okay, I'll share a few lines from the play. Poor Thing by Harish Sharma. Javon Law says, hey, you effing Malay. And Sharifah says, he's not Malay lah, bodoh. Javon Law says, obviously he's Malay, look at him, he's brown. And the person he's referring to is Jerome Koshi, who is actually ethnic Indian, who's filming the whole thing. And he says, it's perfect, some more, some more, some more. Then later on, Javon Law in the car with his wife, Alicia Harris Lim, says, doing reservist some more. How to trust this kind of people to fight for Singapore? He'll probably bomb Singapore and defend Malaysia. Bloody smelly Malay. Okay, other lines. Alicia, who's Javon's wife, says, don't touch me, you're crazy, effing crazy. Sharifah says, bodoh, and then a Malay bad word. Alicia says, there's freaking Malay germs all over me right now. And then Alicia says, you are a freaking terrorist. All you Muslims are terrorists. Sharifah says, what? Alicia said, I just said that Muslims are terrorists. I'm entitled to my opinion. I have a right to my opinion. Okay, so how did MDA respond to this play? A statement given out by MDA was premised on a road rage incident between a young couple and a pair of friends. The play reveals the commonplace stereotypes held among Singaporeans on race and religion. The play is rated R18 with the consumer advice of mature theme and coarse language, as it contains strong racial and religious references, as well as utterances of vulgarities. Okay. And the last play that I want to look at is called Brown is Haram in 2021. Synopsis is an ongoing collaborative project developed by Christian Mark James Paul and Maisara Al-Jaru. This performance lecture explores brown narratives in Singapore, specifically brown social mobility and masculinity. It is based on Christian and Maisara's research and workshops on the lived experiences of both artists and contributors of the project. So just quite a long piece here, but just one bit. Maisara says, wait, So are you saying I got profiled because there was a chance I was abusing drugs? Anyway, the statistics say it's a trend among all races. And Christian says, you were at the staircase, weren't you? We had to take precautions. So he's putting on a role of a policeman here. My Sarah says, so if I was at a staircase as a Malay woman, is either to take drugs or to suck, is that it? Christian says, please mind your language. We are at court, control your emotions. Besides, unfortunately, the statistics show that your community faces the highest number of drugs abuse cases, and statistics don't lie. We have to do all we can to make sure Singapore remains drug-free. Maisara says, but it can be manipulated to frame certain communities as, Miss Maisara, may I remind you that promoting enmity between different groups on grounds of religion or race and doing acts prejudicial to maintenance of harmony is an offense. Besides, how can we be racist? We have minorities in the police force. Okay, so IMDA says Brown is Haram is rated restricted 18 with the consumer advised mature content as the performance contains strong racial references and some sexual references. Okay, so I just want to make a comparison here with a film that was released in the year 1998, done by Jack Neo. It's called Money No Enough. It made $5.8 million at the box office, given a PG-13 rating by MDA, and director Jack Neo was awarded the Cultural Medallion in the year 2005. So I would like to look at a photo there where there's a Malay man who's standing up, and you can see that he's actually reciting the pledge, but in Mandarin. So I'm going to share with you what Kenneth Poltan has said about this scene. To prove his point, Chiu calls upon Malay co-worker Ali, who's not credited, who springs to attention and recites the first two lines of Singapore's national pledge in very poorly pronounced Mandarin. Sorry, it's pledge, not anthem. The office staff burst into thunderous applause, feeding into a racial fantasy in which ethnic minorities willingly and painlessly assimilate into a dominant Chinese-speaking community of Singaporeans. Ali, who wins the approval of his Mandarin-speaking office colleagues for learning to speak their language, is still presented as a buffoon or a trained monkey that will perform a routine the moment it is called upon to do so. Kenneth Poltan imagining the Chinese community through the films of Jack Neo. Another scene from the movie Money No Enough, you see, so the Jack Neo character says, okay, in my office, everyone is called Lee. Another character says, hey, wait, I'm guessing that definitely is not Lee, but he replies, he's also Lee? Yeah, Bengali. And that is, I think, a slang word for Sikh, actually, in Singapore, that's used by some communities. Next slide. So this is another observation by Kenneth. When Hui's sister discovered that her mother is terminally ill, they rush to the hospital, and in the general confusion, surround a stretcher bearing a patient they think is their mother. Anxiously removing the blanket, they are horrified to find under the covers the body of a mustached Indian man instead. So as you can see there, you know, the subtitle says wrong person, and obviously it's for comedic effect. The Indian man there is a punchline. Next slide, and we're going to look at Liang Popo, the movie that was released in 1999. At the end of the film, the character Liang Popo appears in brown face as an Indian woman. And this movie was actually given a PG-13 rating by MDA. And interestingly, it was removed by Netflix from its roster of Jack Neo movies in 2020. So last year in August 2020, they were releasing all these Jack Neo movies. And I believe this movie actually received some complaints. And we can see that Netflix took the step of removing it, and we can kind of see, you know, discuss what are different standards that Netflix and MDA have with regard to these kinds of racist representations. Okay, I will have my concluding observations here. So there might be some kind of discrepancy, as some of you have noticed, right? Why is it plays that I feel are quite anti-racist are given an R18 rating, whereas those films of Jack Neo, which, as I've shared, consist of quite racist speech and actions, were given a very low rating. Parental guidance 13. You know, so actually a lot of children can watch them. Actually, a lot of people have watched them, and I think, you know, if you look at censorship, for example, usually the authorities are very strict with shows that have restricted audiences. So actually theater plays to small audiences. So I don't understand why a blockbuster film would have such a lenient rating, whereas plays which are watched by you know, a tiny minority of the public, and more often than not, it's people who are in a sense already ideologically consonant with what's in a film. So you're not like radicalizing them, politicizing them, you know, have such strict ratings. So these are some of my observations. The first one is that only instances of overt racism are legible to the state. Covert forms of racism, such as microaggressions and racist so-called jokes, which do not trigger violent conflict, are not recognized as racism. Okay. Second point I wish to make is that ratings are a reflection of community norms, which provide cover and validity to majoritarianism. If it is valid for a heterosexual majority to be given special treatment, and I mean through foregrounding of their narratives and suppression of queer narratives, then it would be equally valid for a racial majority to receive similar treatment through foregrounding of their benevolence, their tolerance and sacrifice, as well as suppression of counter discourse. So we know this, right? One of the narratives about multiracial existence in Singapore is that it is built on the sacrifices on the majority. So for example, a majority not demanding that their lingua franca becomes the national language, for example. And I think this is an interesting inversion, because one actually can make the point that our racial harmony, the burden on maintaining it actually rests on the minorities to so-called take a joke, or on them to be able to laugh along when the butt of racist jokes, on them to actually tolerate racist behavior, right? So I find this an interesting inversion. Who's actually making the sacrifice? What about the sacrifice of, say, indigenous communities, right? When it comes to dispossession, when it comes to loss of ancestral lands, when it comes to them, losing, let's say, the certain privileges that might have come about because of their numerical superiority at one point of time in history. And the last point I want to make is that the framework of racial harmony prioritizes avoidance of conflict, non-confrontation, and public tranquility. So public tranquility is a phrase that actually exists in some of our laws, especially the ones that are against so-called wounding the racial feelings, right? So public tranquility, etc. This term, strong racial references, as articulated by MDA, applies not only to racist speech, but anti-racist discourse, if the latter is seen to disrupt racial harmony. So I think this is why we see action being taken against, for example, the rap video that was produced by Zubaidah and Pretty, right? Because I see it as something that's anti-racist, but because it's disruptive of racial harmony, it's considered dangerous and somehow twisted to be something that's supposedly racist. And then there's penalty for that. So I will conclude by saying, yes, without anti-racist discourse, we're actually deprived of an important tool with which to critique and dismantle racism in Singapore. So later on, I hope we can have a rich discussion, and maybe I can elaborate a little bit more about what I mean by anti-racism. But a lot of it, I think Lily has covered when she's mentioned the work of Ibram X. Kendi. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Alfian. It's always great to listen to you present. Okay, Kian.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Can you see my slides? Right. Today, my presentation, I've changed it a bit, and now it's Chinese privilege as metonymy and affordance. And let me just go straight into the presentation. So the Chinese privilege issue has, first, I think, as the presenters, earlier presenters have mentioned, it's developed from a kind of popular discourse since 2014 to academic involvement in the last couple of years. And here, the way I map it would be that it's a spin-off from Humaira Zainul and Walid Abdullah discussion on Chinese privilege in the Singapore's political arena, and that a number of Singaporeans with academic credentials have taken what I see as a defensive stance. Here, they are either denying or qualifying the existence of Chinese privilege and query the applicability of white privilege, which was derived from the American context into the Singaporean context. And quite a number of them draw support from history extending into the colonial period. And for me, ironically, based on their argumentation, they actually bolster the reality of race in their argumentation. In the case of Goh and Chong, not only did they reject the existence of Chinese privilege, especially in the political arena, they also dismissed its relevance, arguing that the issue, in fact, needed discussion on racism. So my paper revisits the question of race in Singapore's history. Instead of race as ground reality and colonial legacy, I would show that the persistence of the use of race as political tool. In other words, my paper shows how racial criteria are used as means of inclusion and exclusion in Singapore, and also privileges are ascribed to certain social groups based on race. That is, I'm examining race as a project of construction and politicization by ruling elites and their effects. I argue that while the colonial and post-colonial racialization projects share similar characteristics, the racial policies undertaken by the PAP regime are particularly toxic, not only developing the racecraft, but also enters the everyday, seeps into every aspect of life in Singapore. In turn, contrary to the arguments of these academics, I argue that the significance of Chinese privilege is not about whether it exists or not, and also argues against the idea that the discussion is a diversion from discussion on racism. But rather, I think it's the issue of Chinese privilege, in fact, is an offering as a metonymy to open up discursive spaces for muffled differences. In turn, I also argue that it also is a kind of affordance for new social alliances. So let me go to the next slide. So developments of race in Singapore are like a kind of what Anne Stoller has called imperial durabilities from the British colonial times. And here I'm relying, of course, a lot on scholars on imperialism, and that as Packden, Bailey, and Harlow has argued, what we see, in fact, is a kind of, during the second phase of European colonialism, imperialism, there is a kind of colonization light that is going on. That is, the European imperialists were not using necessarily settler colonization methods as they did in the Americas, but as they expanded into the Asia and African continents during the 19th and 20th century, they start to do this colonization light by working with the local ruling regimes. So there is basically a kind of race-nation equation that is every nation is equated to a particular race, and also the discussion of native inaptness and the sense of importing migrant labor from other race nations, or all these are of course constructed, and the civilization claims. So all this is really a form of working with the local regimes, where ultimately it supports the idea that the white comes on top. So the sense of basically a kind of inclusion-exclusion mechanism, and ultimately ascribing privileges, especially to the white people. And in the case of the PAP regime in post-colonial Singapore, I'm relying a lot on existing literature. I think there are fantastic works by Jeffrey Benjamin, Nirmala Purushottam, Chua Beng Huat, Lily Kong, and Brenda Yeo, as well as Philip Holden. And basically, drawing from their discussion and evidence of that, they have argued that at first the PAP government saw the multiracial scenario in Singapore as a form of colonial inheritance. But by the late 1970s, there was a deliberate policy to promote racialization. And I think Lily, Lavi, as well as Alfian, especially Lily, has already talked about this discussion of education mother tongue, self-help organizations, ethnic quota in housing regulations, etc. But we see that there is no substantial change, and in fact, it's an entrenchment of the CMIO categories in every aspect of life in Singapore. And furthermore, based on this extant literature, it also indicates that there is especially a kind of privileging of one racial group. And here, of course, we are referring to the so-called ethnic Chinese. And I think Lily has already outlined very well about the Speak Mandarin campaign, SAP school system, and so on. And here, of course, also since 1970s, there's been leadership speeches on racist ideas, and again, Lily has highlighted it just now, so I'm not going to go too much into it. What we basically see is that that race is not going away, but in fact, it is changing and accumulating in the context of Singapore. And this is what Michael Foucault has called tactical mobility of race, and what Anne Stoller has called polyvalent mobility of race, and what Karen Fields and Barbara Fields have called a form of racecraft. That is, racial lexicons accumulate recursively, producing new racial truths as they requisition and reassemble old ones. And here I want to discuss a little bit further on the Singapore state racial policies in perspective. And I argue that under the PAP, racialization policies are especially toxic in three ways. Firstly, it seeps into the everyday. That is no longer just as what Ben Anderson says in the censors, in the colonial press and reports, but it's in fact entering into the everyday life, housing, education, welfare, and all kinds of bureaucratic applications. And what it does is that those having racist ideas had their thoughts enhanced rather than diminished. The second thing is that compared to the colonial period where the white minority comes on top, under the current ruling regime, Chinese becomes conflated with the numerical majority. And it could become an added defensive mechanism when people internalize race. And we have seen how the defensive reaction, and I think also Lily, Lavi, as well as Alfian has highlighted also in their presentations. But here I'm also thinking, for instance, the very defensive reaction over the brown-face incident, as well as discussion on Chinese privilege in Vela Youtham and Sumaya in their 2021 article. It was very well discussed. I do urge you to take a look if you haven't had a chance. And so when, of course, in reality, the ones who really benefit are a very elite and select group. And I argue that this is also bound to result in horizontal conflicts, as seen in the recent racist events and the Chinese instigators in the Orchard Road case, and also the HDB flat case where the Chinese woman was playing gong against Indian neighbor praying. And of course, then you start seeing that the state comes around and play God by imposing the Maintenance of Racial Harmony Act recently. And what is the third aspect that I would see as why the PAP racialization policies are even more toxic than the British colonial ones is that they always fall back on the multiracialism and meritocracy rhetoric. That is, if you fail or underperform, it's because you have problematic racial traits. So this is the, and here I would argue that this is why it is very crucial and very important that Chinese privilege as a discourse has emerged. And I would say that it is very important as a metonymy and affordance. How do I mean by that? As we have seen, the lethal combination of multiracialism and meritocracy, in fact, turns the arrow back at the race for their failures, alleged failures, and it closes off possibilities of dialogue and redress, and also silencing those with grievances. And I believe that Chinese privilege, in fact, breaks the discussion of Chinese privilege, in fact, breaks the multiracialism plus meritocracy mantra. How do I mean by Chinese privilege as a metonymy? I'm using the ideas of Alco Ronia And this is, it is, as I see, a metonymy to the persisting racism in Singapore. Metonymy, according to Runier, is a metaphor for the entwinement of continuity and discontinuity. And metonymy both connects to and juxtaposes against the racist phenomenon. How is it a continuity? It connects very well the phrase of Chinese privilege to many racist happenings, both in the state policies and measures, as well as what is happening in the society for many decades. And the discontinuity is, of course, here pointing to that it is being derived from the term white privilege. It is, however, able to, as I see, it is able to result in a paradigm shift such that there's no other frame to understand the situation anymore aside from Chinese privileges. And why I also argue here that Chinese privilege is a kind of affordance. Here I'm relying on the concept by Webb-Cain, which was spelled out in his book, in 2015 book, and also his recent article in 2018. That is that he highlights, drawing on the discussion on the second wave feminist movement. He highlights the importance of giving it a name to allow for breaking the enforced silence and afford new conversations and social alliances. So what he is arguing is that when you have a name, for instance, like Chinese privilege, you actually help to push for the naming, the objectification, the visualization of a problem, together with the relative ease of social media like WhatsApp, Twitter, Facebook, rap music, drawing from the Black Lives Matters, critical race theories. And the notion why it's so important to have a term like Chinese privilege is that it is otherwise very difficult to dislodge state racism and societal racism, which was partly enabled by state racism, without giving it a name. So it's not unlike, I think, as Webb-Cain has pointed out, terms like date rape, male chauvinism, and also gender inequality. It actually allows people to gather force and give name to their emotions of anger and enable the coming together of the collective in the second wave feminist movement. I think this is the potentiality of Chinese privilege, to allow for consciousness raising and for people to stand up against state and state-sponsored racism in Singapore beyond the CMIO categories, to configure what Webb-Cain says, a new we with new affinities and affiliations, to make new grounds of relevance to combat systemic injustice. All right, this is the end of my presentation.
Wow, perfect, on time. Great, so now, turn on my video, we can go on to the Q&A. We've got basically 4 questions on the deck so far, 2 each for Lavi and Lee. I'll read them out. So that they're basically from Chansamaya and also Abdullah. Okay, so for Lavi, do you see a parallel narrative between the PRC and Singapore Chinese and the Indians from India and Singaporean Indians? The other question for you is, does the North-South divide render the Indian category obsolete in Singapore, considering the immigration patterns? If so, what do you suggest to remedy this problem? Now, for Lily, we've got the first one is, in your view, is there an increasing disconnect between the establishment, broadly, not just political, and the younger generation when it comes to race and religion? Or is this observation just a function of us being in our own echo chambers? The other question for Lily is, what affordances does Chinese privilege as an anti-racist tool offer, as opposed to intervening in incidents of racism, structural and everyday. I'll throw something out for the whole panel also to think about. One is there seems to be this seizing on this idea of critical race theory by the establishment, especially I think Chinese in Singapore, with a lot of vehemence. Now, this is, of course, as everyone knows, a concept that comes out from North America and has been subject to a lot of vilification by the right wing in the US. So why does it have so much traction in Singapore? And secondly, alluded to in the earlier question was, I mean, essentially we're looking at a Singapore where between 1/5 and a quarter of marriages are with non-residents, right? People who are non-Singaporeans. This will change our demographic. How do you think this would affect, right, ideas about race and racism in Singapore? Okay, Lavi, why don't you take it away?
Okay, thanks very much for those questions. I'll start with the question maybe on North-South divide and whether that's making the Indian category obsolete. So I think North-South divide is just one kind of divide that's going on. The class divide I actually see as more significant than that, more than linguistic divides. But I think all these kind of intra-ethnic divisions, as we think of them, point not just to the category of Indian being obsolete, but really, you know, the idea of governing by race as problematic, right? The notion of Indian or the notion of Chinese, I think is you know, very artificial. And these demographic changes, shifts that are brought about by immigration that have created changes within the Chinese category, but also within the Indian category, are making this artificiality of race even more obvious, and I think pushing us towards thinking about, you know, the need for tweaking or getting rid of these categories. And I think Ian's point about increasing transnational marriages, but also inter-ethnic marriages, right, between you know, Indian Singaporeans and Chinese Singaporeans, or Malay Singaporeans and Indian Singaporeans, that's also complicating these notions of race. So I think all these kind of demographic changes are really causing us to, you know, and I think there have been some noises from the you know, government about how we need to tweak these categories, right? So that brings me then to the second question about similarities between Chinese migrants and, you know, dynamics, Singaporean Chinese, Indian migrants, and Singaporean Indians. So Elaine Ho and I have co-written a paper that came out a few months ago, kind of tracing some of these overlaps, I guess. But what I wanted to kind of bring out in this paper here is that because of the minority status of Indians in Singapore, there is an additional kind of tax or penalty that they have to pay in terms of asserting or showing belonging to the nation, right? And this large immigrant group that's changing the Indian category, right? They are very large proportion now of Indian in Singapore, are making this even more significant, right, for Indians to assert, to prove, and to claim belonging to the nation. So I think in that way, the two groups are different, right? They have some similar dynamics going on in terms of immigration, but the Indian group, because of their minoritized status, they have different pressures. Okay,
thank you. Lily?
Yes, well, thank you for the two questions to those that listened to the presentation. Yeah, I think it's quite obvious that there is a disconnect between the establishment, the PAP establishment, and the younger generation. I mean, they even admit it in the statements by PAP ministers and others. They say that younger generation Singaporeans are more open to ideas from the West, the United States, are open to the ideas associated with critical race theory and so on. They are more global. They use social media and so on, as opposed to older generation Singaporeans. But what's interesting about the perspective of these, the PAP establishment ministers and so on, they say that the younger generation have forgotten that in the 50s and 60s, Singapore was in turmoil, racial turmoil, political crisis, and a whole range of crises. They've forgotten all of this. Older generation haven't forgotten all of this. So somehow this perspective of the leadership, the forgetting the forgetting, some people have forgotten, other people have remembered. And I think it's a very simplistic dichotomy of the mindset of the younger generation. And here again, there are younger Singaporeans who also, who might hold racist views. So it's not black and white, as is often portrayed. But, you know, with politicians, they often think about elections, electoral outcomes. And if we look at various constituencies, what's really interesting is that I think in the last elections, 2020, there was a sizable number of the first voters or younger Singaporeans who voted for the opposition, particularly the Workers' Party and other opposition parties. I think the PAP tends to be a little bit, you know, apprehensive about this trend. This is a party that likes to often plan and plot ahead. And so this is something that they need to, that they feel as though they need to address, but they've not addressed it very effectively. What is required, as I noted in my introduction, the earlier half of my presentation, is a substantive, genuine, authentic public discussion with regard to these difficult issues. It's not good enough to invite safe people you can predict what they're going to say, apologists, a few academics with, you know, critical perspectives here and there. But by and large, you know, the Alfian, can you hear me? I've lost, I can't see the others. Can you hear me? Can the others hear me?
Yes, we can.
You know, for example, why hasn't Alfian Saad been invited to any of these forums? You know, this is surprising to me. The issue, and the second question, I think, is related to this point: the need to have substantive discussion on Chinese privilege. You know, in order to, I think, engage in a healthy way, we need to be honest. We need to be uncomfortable. We need to confront issues. We need to acknowledge weaknesses. We need to learn from those weaknesses, the discomfort. We need to listen to the voices of those who have experienced microaggressions, macroaggressions all their lives. We need to listen to these voices. It's not just, and what we're hearing are the same voices. Everything was okay. It's just a few individuals. We are largely a healthy, multiracial, meritocratic society. And that is not the case. And I think I've highlighted it in my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. Let me now turn to Alfian, but before that, there's a question for you specifically, which is from Walid also. The burden of racial harmony is on the minorities, which is so true. Is this a function of merely being a minority group or specific circumstances in Singapore? All right.
Yeah, so I'll just answer that very briefly. I think in most societies, if you're a minority, I think it's true that if you make a little bit of noise, if you object to certain characterizations or certain actions or speeches, you're going to be considered oversensitive, you know. So there's the figure, for example, the angry black man, angry black women. You always have to project a certain kind of amicability, and that relies on you being tolerant of certain behaviors. That said, though, I think in Singapore, it's inflected also by this whole national security issue, right, when it comes to race. So you know, not only are you expected not to object, but then also your objection might result in upsetting public order, public harmony. So again, I think that framework of racial harmony is something very problematic if we tend to prioritize it over, let's say, anti-racism, right? I think that for me is a fundamental problem in Singapore, that we value racial harmony over anti-racism.
Great. Kian?
Sorry, I wasn't sure what
No,
I
threw out some general questions. If you don't want to respond to them, that's fine. We can go back to Lavi actually, because we've got a couple of other questions. I'll read out briefly. We've been given a little bit more time since we started late, which is okay. So for Lavi, so your term racial assemblages, you seem to be made to rush a bit when you're talking about it. So could you just elaborate very briefly on your theorization? And then also on the here are some issues that I think go out more on for Lavi also. So how does the Malay community view or internalize what are their concerns in relation to immigration primarily from India and China in balancing the ethnic status quo? I'll throw out a couple more things out here. We'll get to that. If we get to them, we get to them. If not, it's all right. So have there been any significant shift in the way that the state addresses or clamps down on consciousness raising in Singapore about racism, especially in light of FICA recently? And when we look at the videos on social media that are spread, is there some sort of view that a particular ethnic group is being persecuted? Has it been harder to do research on this in Singapore? And I guess for we can hear some specific questions for you. Race privilege is similar to other forms of privilege where the intent is an exercise of power to oppress. So aside from state-centric perspectives of racialization, Chinese Singaporeans also have been able to dismiss Chinese privilege precisely by pointing their finger at state policies. So who does Chinese privilege as an analytical tool benefit, right? And finally, also for Hui Kian, in Singapore, there's a robust infrastructure for Chinese studies, broadly defined, Chinese Heritage Center departments of Chinese studies, etc. What's their role in anti-racist work? Or has academic or public interest or focus on preserving Chinese culture, language come from an Anglophone establishment perspective result in a reluctance to address these issues? Let's start with you, because just now we didn't have you respond. Putting you on the spot.
Yes, right. Sorry, I'm very bad at so I'll just maybe assert again that I'm not talking about Chinese privilege as an analytical tool. I'm talking about it as an important phrase that allows for the naming of emotions of anger, and I think we have to recognize this emotions of anger coming from a very systemic forms of racialization. And what I'm trying to argue is that it is very historical, as I think the academicians have pointed out in the when I put on my first slide on the discussion on Chinese privilege. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that it is really not about whether Chinese privilege exists or not, or whether or not it should be used as an analytical tool, or whether it diverts discussion. But I think it is important that we have a name that allows people to express their emotions of anger. And I think what we should see is not about seeing these people as belonging to the minorities, but I'm urging that we should actually come out precisely of I feel that many people have been already in Singapore have already been racialized, meaning that they have already accepted the CMIO categories within themselves, which makes it very difficult for them to see that when Chinese privilege is being fronted, they see it as an affront because they already recognize with a racialized label. So I'm trying to say we look at Chinese privilege as a name for emotions of anger, and for anyone who to empathize with these emotions of anger. And in fact, I think if I'm going to be named as labeled as a Chinese Singaporean, I should be angry too, because why am I trapped in this racial what do you call it, racial categorization and made to see all these racial conflicts and violence that's happening in Singapore. So my urge is that we should see Chinese privilege as a way to group people together to form to form a new collective beyond CMIO, which is precisely the trap of the state, whether it's the colonial state or whether it's the post-colonial state, and that it actually enables us to come together as a new collective to, in fact, fight racism. That's
Great, thank you. So Lavi, the questions, so I'm directing them back to you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. Maybe I'll answer the one about Malay community. So I'm in the midst of now collecting data with a colleague who's a master's student at RSIS. We've been collecting some data with more, let's say, working class Malay Singaporeans and trying to understand their attitudes towards immigration, and very early stages still. So, but so far, actually, surprisingly, we haven't found a lot of negative attitudes, animosity towards migrants themselves. I mean, there's some around national service, there is some kind of like unhappiness, let's say, but not so much around jobs. And, there is this discourse of, migrants as adding to the nation. So some kind of replication, I think, of state discourse as well. But yeah, early stages. So far, we're not finding, a lot of opposition, animosity by working class Malay Singaporeans, which is maybe unusual, but maybe not, right? So early stages. Then with the question on assemblages, I'm still in the early stages of fleshing out the idea, but why I liked assemblages, I guess, is because the assemblage invokes a kind of flat ontology, right? So we're not when we're thinking about race as assemblage, we're not privileging, let's say nationality, or we're not privileging ancestry, but really thinking about how different aspects of different factors, different variables, whether it's time, come together and create these complex formations that come into being at specific times, right? So I think it allows us not to privilege certain aspects over others when we think about race. So that's what I'm trying to play with the term assemblage, but it's early stages yet, but so look out for forthcoming.
All right. Sorry, Livy, it's something to say?
Yes, it's me. Yep. I'd like to highlight this point, which was noted about Chinese privilege, in that it's linked to emotions. To me, and this is what my presentation attempted to do, Chinese privilege, white privilege, it could be Hindu privilege in India, it could be Malay privilege in Malaysia. Privilege exists. So what do we understand by privilege? It's about power. Who wields power? Who's got the resources? Who dictates, who sets the parameters, and so on. So it's also linked to policies, who determines policies. So it's more than just about emotions. So when privilege is pointed out, when Malay privilege is pointed out, for example, in Malaysia, I'm Malay, why should I be upset or defensive if it's a fact? If there are policies which disadvantage Indians and Chinese and others in Malaysia. Similarly, a Chinese Singaporean who analyzes facts, policies, looks at the objective data, is likely to also accept there is Chinese privilege if these are objective truths. So why is it emotions, particularly if we are social scientists and academics? Why do we get emotional about these issues when they are, I mean, we can get emotional, but it's rooted in reality. So policies are really important. I think where we, can get emotional, perhaps as a Singaporean, I'm still a Singaporean, even though I've worked in Australia for many years, it is, for me anyhow, the betrayal of these ideals, the national flag, the national anthem, and other ideals associated with what meritocracy is supposed to mean, what multiracialism is supposed to mean. It's a betrayal of all this, particularly since the late 1970s from the early 1980s. as I noted, the SAP, EIP, GRC, and a slew of other policies. These are not consistent with establishing a genuinely multiracial, meritocratic society. And this is where, you know, this is where I think people are entitled to feel there's something not quite right there. And being a Malay as well, and I think Alfian highlighted this, you know, Laavanya talked about people questioning Indian identity. You might have served national service, you might be a Singapore citizen, second generation, and so on. But the Constitution of Singapore, Section 152, recognizes Malays as the indigenous people of Singapore. And often, our status, our language is questioned. Our place in society is questioned. That is a burden to carry. That is a really heavy burden to carry when you are a second-class citizen in Singapore, despite what the Constitution says about your status.
All right. I think we're running up to time, so I'll give Lily the last word. But I guess there was one question that I guess I'll read out for us to sort of think about as we leave, which is there's a notion that you know, Chinese privilege is being denied because older Chinese believe that they are, or feel that they're being sidelined because they cannot speak English. So their Chinese culture doesn't give them special privilege in Singapore. So this is, I think, something that we have to grapple with. It's a big issue when we're already a little bit over time, but it's something that I really do hope by putting this panel together, we can continue the discussion. A lot of that discomfort, a lot of the friction, I think is important. It's important as a way to learn and to do better by our own lights, and also to live up to some of those ideals that Lily had pointed out that are entrenched in the Singapore Constitution, the pledge, and also the flag. So let me end there because I know we're over time. Thank you for bearing with us and our technical difficulties earlier on. I hope we can continue on the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks,
you
everybody.
so much. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ian.
Right.
Shall we
Thank
start?
Thank you.
Ian.
Yes. Right.
Thank you.
Thanks so
All
much.
right. Thank you, everyone. All right.
Thank you.